I've discovered of everyone meeting on video is that everybody arranges a meeting for about 2 minutes after the last meeting ended. So 3 o'clock is our absolute deadline this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to hand over to Catherine Ashford, who hopefully can take the rest through the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks to everyone for coming to this session. I was just reminding myself that when I started in this job in the beginning of March, finding ways to work with Homes for Cathy was one of the very first recommendations that I got from talking to Chris Hancock in our best practice team. So I'm really pleased to be here and to have so many people on the call. So I'll just start sharing my screen and running through the session. Okay, I'm hoping you can all see that. I've got a nod from Sandy. Brilliant. Okay, right. So in the session that Michael mentioned at the beginning of September, I raced through some content, and I was really conscious of going really quickly in that session. So I'm glad we've got a little bit more time today, and I can share some more ideas with you as we go through. So this is a quick overview of the session. I'll go through our Framing Homelessness research and what the research told us. And that breaks down roughly into kind of 3 sections. I'll recap on what our research tells us about the shared sector understanding of homelessness. I'll show you our findings on UK public thinking about homelessness. And I'll also show you some of our most effective frames, our most effective values and metaphors for reframing homelessness from crisis and from other places of those frames in practice. As Michael mentioned, we've got time in the agenda for questions and reflections, and we'll have a breakout session where you'll be able to discuss your response to. And also at the end of this pack, I've got some exercises that you might want to try out in your own time, but we won't have time to run through those today, but they are there if you'd like to have a go later on. So firstly, just a quick note on the project that I'm working on. I joined Crisis in March this year to lead our Framing Homelessness project. It's jointly funded by Crisis and by Comic Relief. It started in July last year and runs for the next 4 years. And we're working in partnership with Homeless Link and with Cymorth Cymru in Wales, and also with support from Homeless Action Scotland Institute, who conducted the original research that I'll share with you this afternoon. And we're continuing to work with frameworks to develop new training resources for the homelessness sector to share across the next few years. And the purpose really of the project overall is to support and encourage and enable anyone working in homelessness across the UK to understand the evidence that we now have on framing homelessness, and to think about how across any form of communications you might be able to put some of the insights and ideas into practice in your own work. Okay, so as Michael mentioned, Paul has shared with me the list of organisations joining the session today, and it's fantastic to see so many different types of organisations and different roles within those. And whatever your role, whatever area you're working in, there will be a time when you want to say something about homelessness, and that might be something formal piece of communications, or it might be informal. So before we dive into the results of the research, I just wanted to pause for a few moments and ask you to think about the questions on this slide, and perhaps write down your answers to them. You might want to refer to them at the end of the session. So what's one thing that you want people to know about homelessness? It might be something that you're trying to communicate at the moment, or something you want to communicate in the future. And do you feel that that message is being heard? Is it getting through to your audience? And if not, what might be getting in the way of people hearing your message currently? So I'll just stop talking for a few seconds if you want to write down your initial responses to those questions. Okay. And now, just before I dive into the research, I just wanted to share with you the nature of the session coming up. So I have research insights to share with you. I've got principles and ideas for communicating about homelessness that you might want to experiment with and build on what you're already doing. I don't have hard and fast rules or exact forms of words. It's more about encouraging a sort of framing outlook, or looking at your work through a framing lens that I'd like you to leave the session with today, rather than a sense of how to do things right or how to do things wrongly. This is really about ideas to experiment with in your own work. Okay, so the research itself. A couple of years, Crisis commissioned the Frameworks Institute to take a really deep look at homelessness in the UK, at attitudes towards it, across 2 phases of work. And the phases of work produced 2 reports, and they're the reports that you can see here on the screen, and they're published on the Crisis website if you'd like to read them yourself. I'd really encourage you to take a look at the reports, and they're really interesting and easy to read, and they aren't too long. So the first phase of the research looked at 4 things. The first part of it, through a series of in-depth interviews with organisations across the sector, sought to get a really good understanding of the sector's shared view of homelessness in the UK. So it looks at what homelessness is, who's affected by it, what causes it, what consequences it has, whether homelessness can be ended, whether homelessness can be prevented, what solutions there are. And I'll recap on the research findings of that shared story in a few minutes. Then secondly, the first phase of the research looked at sector materials, so communications materials, lots of different types of things, campaign work, social media, press releases, looked at what the sector was pushing out on homelessness, looked at images used, what messages were included in materials produced by the sector. And then thirdly, the first phase of the research looked at media coverage. So across the spectrum of different media in the UK, broadcast, print, online, looked at trying to get a really good understanding of how homelessness is covered. And then lastly, but not least, public thinking through focus groups, on-street interviews and surveys. First phase of the research sought to get a really deep understanding of public views on homelessness across the UK. So the research took place in England, Scotland and in Wales. And what the first phase of the research found is that there is a gap between the sector view of homelessness and public thinking. And when often, not always, but often, when we look at sector material and when we look at media coverage of homelessness, we can see that gap being fueled by messages included there. So in the second phase of the research, Frameworks Institute then went on to test different ways of communicating about homelessness, different frames, to see if we could shift public thinking toward the sector view of homelessness and build public commitment for the kinds of policy action and changes, systems changes that we know are needed to end homelessness for good. And the results of those tests I will take you through later on in the presentation and show you some examples of how those frames are being put into practice. And overall, the research involved more than 10,000 people in the UK. So it helps us feel confident that the research base is robust. And the research methodology is designed to get to really deeply held ideas. So not necessarily ideas that would change quickly over time, but those really deeply held views on homelessness. So just to recap on the shared sector story, which you will be very familiar with, so I will do this quickly. So what homelessness is: a lack of affordable, safe, secure, and by secure we mean long-term accommodation, the lack of a home. Homelessness can be hidden, like sofa surfing, or visible, like rough sleeping, and can be short or long-term. And in the sector view, there are some groups that are more at risk of homelessness than others. And you'll see when we come to look at a short film capturing public views of homelessness that there are some synergies here between the groups of people that members of the public associate with homelessness and these groups. But there are also some groups prominent in the shared sector story that are missing from public thinking. And then the causes of homelessness. So in the shared sector story, we're talking about systems causes. So poverty is one of the biggest drivers of homelessness, unaffordable rents, a lack of social housing, a lack of adequate welfare support for people at risk, violence and trauma, mental health and physical health issues, and a lack of access to the support needed for those issues, and relationships breaking down. So all of the causes of homelessness, systems and structural causes, appear in the sector story. And when we look at consequences of homelessness, it's the idea that homelessness does not just affect an individual experiencing it or the people immediately around them, but it has wider negative effects on communities, on our services, on the economy, and on society. And turning to whether homelessness can be ended, shared sector view is that yes, it can be ended through the right policy choices. Those choices make it possible to stop homelessness from happening in the first place and to end it. And these are some of the policy areas that appear in the shared sector story. And it's this story that the frames that I'll go on to show you in a few minutes are designed to help us to tell. And it's shifting the narrative around homelessness that builds public support for the type of policy change that we know is required. And that's really the theory of change advocated by the Frameworks Institute. So I'll move on now to look at public attitudes. What people think about homelessness. These are widely shared views. So just before we go into the video, I'd like you to pause just for a couple of seconds and have a think about what you think people will say. And also what comes to mind when you think about homelessness. I'll just pause for a few seconds. Okay, let's watch the video.
What comes to mind when you think of home?
Warmth.
Warm, cozy.
Warm and comfortable.
Nice warm surroundings and family.
With people that you care about.
Family.
A home is a happy family and a nice bond.
Family.
Family. People more than a building or anything like that.
It's like the house I live in with my family.
You could live in any house.
Okay.
But your home is where your family are.
So what about the word homelessness? What does that make you think of?
Living on the streets.
Living on the streets.
Sleeping on the street, could be living on the street.
People on the streets.
Be out in all weathers.
Cold.
Cold, freezing cold, dark nights.
Why does homelessness happen?
Drug addiction.
Addiction issues,
Drug and alcohol addiction.
psychological issues.
I'm sure a large percentage of the people who are homeless and on the streets have got mental health issues.
Mental health.
Mental health issues.
Could be broken homes.
It could be family issues.
Breakdown of family.
People whose marriages are broken up and have nowhere else to go.
Family might have kicked them out.
Kicked out of their homes.
Some people, it was due to their way of life.
They couldn't pay rent, they didn't know how to look after their money.
And also there's people that choose to live on the street as well.
Okay. Certainly some people, as far as homelessness, that is their choice.
People that are down on their luck.
Some have had absolutely, just a bad deal.
Circumstances that just life issues.
It's not their own fault. It's just society has changed so much. Jobs are hard to come by.
There's massive social issues that impact on people's lives.
The jobs aren't there, people get chucked out their house.
Suffering so much social abuses.
And end up in a downward spiral.
You become disenchanted with society.
It's a kind of ever-decreasing circle.
Who's responsible for homelessness happening?
Obviously, the government, probably a government responsibility.
The government has to take some form of responsibility on how things are done. Government had to pay attention to it a little bit more.
10% of the population own 90% of the wealth.
And so it's just frustrating how people can claim that, there's no money for these things when there is so much money.
They take chances away from people, and of course they make it sound good as they're doing it.
See, people can't work, and they're denigrated for not working, because there is no work.
So what do you think should be done to address homelessness?
More money into mental health facilities.
Good addiction support for people who fall by the wayside.
I guess more money put into social state, into hostels and things.
I think it'll always happen, regardless.
I suppose it's all kind of chicken and egg things.
You will always find them. You will always see it. People will always run into difficulties and problems.
Some of the kind of people you see around here are actually tragically almost beyond help.
Okay, I know there's a lot to take in that film. Some of you may have seen it before. I've watched it so many times.
What comes to mind when
new themes from it? But just to give you some of the bigger themes from that video and from the wider research from the first phase. So homelessness, you'll have seen in that film, overwhelmingly connected with rough sleeping. And when we ask people about why homelessness happens, there's a real sense of individualism here. And there's a sense of blaming individuals for bad choices. You'll have seen strong associations in this video with drug and alcohol use, but also the sense of individualism takes different forms as well. So you've seen lots of mention of mental health issues, of poor management of money. Here you'll have also seen the idea that people might be making homelessness as a lifestyle choice. And when it comes to who is affected by homelessness, in the wider research, there are 3 groups in particular that are strongly connected with homelessness. Firstly, middle-aged men associated with drug and alcohol abuse and strongly associated with rough sleeping. Women who are fleeing abuse, and children running away, young people running away from home. And then when we ask people about the solutions, what we might do to address homelessness, you'd have seen in that film, silence. It's really hard for people to answer that question. And when they can answer, their minds go to emergency measures like emergency drug and alcohol services or like hostels. And when you think about it, those measures make complete sense. They chime in with the view of rough sleeping as homelessness, as I've described. And also in the wider research, there is a sense that services are there. If they're not being used, it's because people don't know about them, or people are taking an active choice not to engage with the services that are available. And when we ask about who is responsible for homelessness, you'll have seen from this film, there's a really strong sense of government responsibility for protecting people, which is helpful to us. But there is also a strong sense of skepticism here about whether government is making the right choices or whether it's choosing to address this issue. And we've also got a sense of being at the mercy of universal forces like the economy, like jobs. And that is helpful to us also because it gives us the idea that some people sit at the brink, but there's also a sense that we can't do anything to control the economy. It almost has a life of its own. And when we add up these things, it gives us three big challenges for our communications on homelessness. The narrow definition of homelessness, of what it is, i.e. rough sleeping, and who it affects, small groups of people, means that the logical solutions for homelessness are also narrow. And individualism, the blaming of individuals, the idea that homelessness happens because people make bad choices or they have bad luck, leaves systems and structures in the background. And prevention is really missing from people's thinking around homelessness. So when we add all of this up together, we get a sense of fatalism, a sense that homelessness will always happen and that there isn't something effective that we can do about it. And when we look at communications practice in the sector and we look at coverage of communications in the media, we can see some of these ideas being reinforced. So when we look at coverage, media coverage, for example, which is the top statistic here, almost 50% of media coverage in our original study focused on rough sleeping. And the next biggest segment was 11% on sofa surfing. And you can see that kind of proportion reflected in sector materials too. And when we looked at materials from the media and from the sector that we could categorise as a system story, so a story that included systems causes of homelessness and systems solutions, we could only categorise about 20% of those materials in that systems category. And when we looked at societal level consequences, so consequences beyond the individual experiencing homelessness for wider society, we could only categorise a small proportion of sector materials and media materials in that way. And when we look at a lot of media coverage in particular, we can see the idea that homelessness is out of control. So what can we do? This is where framing comes in to the picture. Framing is using the evidence that we have to guide the language and image choices we make when we're telling stories. Framing evidence can help us think through what we want to emphasize, how we can explain things to build understanding of how homelessness happens, to build empathy and to build emotional connection and collective responsibility. And really importantly, our framing evidence can help us to think through and be really aware of what to leave unsaid. And when we do all of these things together, we can equip people to think really differently. And we can frame with values. We can frame our messages with really commonly shared, deeply felt ideas about what is important in life, what is right and wrong, to help us drive emotional commitment to our causes and also collective responsibility for them. We can frame with metaphors, which help us to explain in really concrete and easy to understand ways why homelessness happens and how the solutions that we're arguing for can help. And also help us to drive empathy and emotional connection with the experience of homelessness. We can also frame with wider experience, telling a wider set of stories about homelessness and making sure that in those stories we have context. We bring in the circumstances that people are living in, the structures and systems that are affecting their lives. And lastly, we can avoid othering, and I'll give you just some small examples of language tweaks that can help us to do that. So first, framing with values. This is an extract from our original research, which shows how we tested different ways of communicating about homelessness using values. And we took members of the public and divided them into 5 groups. One group was a control group who didn't receive any message about homelessness, and then 4 other groups. And each group received one message framed in a certain way. So the first group received a message about homelessness framed with ideas of compassion, that we should love and care for everyone in society. The second group received a message about homelessness framed with equality of opportunity. Third group received a message about homelessness framed with the idea of our interdependence and interconnection in society, how our lives are all connected. And the last group received a message about homelessness framed with moral human rights, so the idea that a home, having access to a safe, affordable, secure home is a moral human right. And we then asked each of those groups to answer a series of questions about homelessness that had lots of different possible responses. And we found that those who'd read a message about homelessness framed with interdependence, or those who'd read a message about homelessness framed with moral human rights, gave answers to the questions about homelessness that were much closer to the shared sector's view of homelessness. We found that using those frames enabled us to build understanding of homelessness and to build support for policy action and change. So we can be confident that using both of these frames, moral human rights and interdependence, can increase the power of our messages about homelessness. And here are 2 very simple articulations of these values frames, and I'll read through them now. So in our society, we believe in treating everybody with dignity and humanity and upholding everyone's basic human rights. All of us as human beings have a moral right to decent housing, yet right now, many people in our country are homeless. No one should be forced to live this way, to live like this rather. Treating all people with dignity and humanity means making sure everyone can afford a safe and stable home. And just a couple of watch outs with using the moral human rights frame. We're not talking about a legal right to housing here. This is a moral imperative that we're talking about. And it is quite tempting sometimes to use language around deserves in this frame. Everyone deserves a home. But our research would suggest avoiding that because it triggers the idea of some people being deserving and some people being undeserving of support. So we would advise simply swapping deserves with should when you're using moral human rights framing. And then interdependence. In our society, what affects one of us affects all of us. When some people are struggling, it hurts everyone. Right now, many people in our country are homeless, and this affects us all. Making sure everybody has safe, stable housing benefits us all by creating a stronger society. So both of these frames are working hard for us in 2 ways. They're helping to dislodge the idea that homelessness only affects and only matters to a small group of people in our population by placing the issue of homelessness in a much wider context of humanity and the wider context of our society. And both of these frames also bring in stable housing into the picture, so they bring in the solution. And now I've just got some examples of using this framing. So the forms of words that you can see here are drawn from our Framing Homelessness Toolkit, which is published on the Crisis website for anybody to use. And these are just some examples of interdependence framing set to possible forms of words that you might like to use in your communications. I'm not saying that you have to use these forms of words. These are just some examples of interdependence framing in practice. And I won't run through all of these now, but I'll leave you in your own time to have a look at these and see whether you think some of these might work for you. And next, I've got an example of Crisis using interdependence framing in some of its latest communications. This is a film taken from our Home for All campaign in response to the pandemic. And I invite you to have a little watch of this and see if you can spot different forms of interdependence framing in here.
I got the keys for this flat on the 22nd of April. Here I was standing in my own home, and I've never been more comfortable in my life.
So we've been able to give out, obviously with generous donations, mobile phones, care packages, and lots of other great resources that we've received from other people's generosity.
So just to recap some of the examples of interdependence framing that you might have noticed in that film, lots of use of the word society and underlining the steps that society has taken to respond to the pandemic. Lots of use of pronouns we, us, our, let's, and emphasis on what we can achieve moving forward. You'll also have seen some other frames in there, the wider experience of homelessness, and also positioning home as the solution, and drawing those ideas together in the campaign title, Home for All. And next, moral human rights framing. So again, here is an extract from our toolkit with some forms of words putting moral human rights framing into practice that you might want to have a play with in your own communications. So a couple of examples: everyone has the right to a safe and stable home. Decent housing is a basic human need. No one should be forced to live like this. And here's an example of Crisis using moral human rights framing in our communications. So this is a media piece about homelessness death statistics last year, and the line extracted there on the left-hand side was from a Crisis press release and commentary from our chief executive, John Sparks. Behind these statistics are human beings who, like all of us, had talents and ambitions, and we find that moral human rights framing in particular is being picked up in media coverage. It really seems to resonate. And here, just an example of framing stats using values. It's really powerful to begin a piece of writing on using statistics with a values frame, because it helps to explain why the number is important and what the number means, rather than using the number alone and leaving people to try and make that meaning for themselves. So here, it's not right that in a classroom of 30, on average, 9 children would now be living in poverty. And notice here the use of a classroom, a mental image to help people to understand what you're trying to say with this statistic. And using mental images brings me on to the next recommendation from our framing research, which is framing with metaphor, using metaphors to interrupt default thinking and provide people with strong mental images that they can relate to help them to understand something which is abstract to them or complex, and make it simple and concrete. And using metaphors really helps us to explain why something happens, rather than leaving it as something that's normal or natural in someone's eyes. And as we did with values that you saw earlier in the presentation, the original research tested several different metaphors for explaining why homelessness happens. And this is the one that performed most strongly in the research. So the idea of constant pressure. So poverty puts constant pressure on people. If the pressure builds up, people can be pushed into homelessness. This pressure comes from high housing costs, low wages, and inadequate government support, which can build up to a breaking point. A sudden increase in pressure from a life event like losing a job, a relationship breakdown, or a health crisis can quickly become unbearable and force people into homelessness. So you can see this metaphor is working hard for us in several different ways. It's helping us to bring in the external circumstances, the external forces that are bearing on people's lives, like high housing costs, in this example, like low wages, which can build up and force people to a tipping point and into homelessness. Using pressure also helps us to build empathy, to help people to understand what it feels like to be forced from your home by forces and things that you cannot control. So this metaphor is really powerful for helping us to explain why homelessness happens, what it feels like, and also it's really helpful for bringing in solutions, because you can use this metaphor to describe how solutions can relieve the pressure or can stop pressure building up to such an extent that someone is forced into homelessness. And this is a really simple example of a before and after using this metaphor. So homelessness is caused by a combination of high rents and low wages. And after adding in this metaphor, homelessness happens when the constant pressure of high rents and low wages pushes people to the brink and into homelessness. So you can see a simple change can help to bring in this metaphor. And here's an example of crisis using this in a recent, this is a recent comment about the temporary eviction ban that was in place during the pandemic. As it currently stands, the future of renters in this country is incredibly precarious, with mounting financial pressure and job insecurity caused by the pandemic, leaving many struggling to pay rent. The temporary ban on evictions has made a big difference in protecting tenants, but as this is currently set to lift at the end of August, many people could still be forced into homelessness during this ongoing public health emergency. So you can see here an example of using this in policy comment. It's also really useful in personal stories for helping to explain the experience of what it felt like to be under these types of pressure, to feel like walls are closing in, to feel weighed down. There's lots of different ways of articulating this metaphor in personal stories that can really help bring to life the experience of homelessness. And also when you're telling stories, when you're perhaps introducing personal stories, there are some really simple choices to make in language switches that we can make to build in this metaphor and help us avoid reinforcing the idea that people fall into homelessness or that homelessness is a result of their bad choices. And we've got some avoid and embrace and examples here. So rather than using someone ended up or found themselves homeless, replacing that with forced into or pushed into homelessness. Rather than describing someone as losing everything, being more specific about what happened, so they were forced to leave their job or couldn't afford their rent. And replacing decisions and choices made by people, instead describing what options were available and how limited those options were. These are just small changes that can have a big impact on our communications. And another idea that I wanted to share with you is framing with a wider experience of homelessness and bringing in those systems and structures into the story. And this is a clip, it's a few minutes long, from Professor Green's Hidden Homelessness series on BBC Three a little while ago, which I think is a really powerful example of showing the wider experience of homelessness and bringing in external context, circumstances, the pressures that people are facing. So I'll play this as an example of framing with wider experience and context.
Homelessness has many faces. It has every colour, every creed, every gender.
I keep hearing the term hidden homeless get thrown around.
They're either in hostels, because they're still classed as homeless,
sofa
surfing, bouncing from place to place.
You can walk past someone in a business suit, man, this guy could be homeless. You don't know, like, don't give homelessness a face. That's what I say.
Today I'm back on the ends, back in Clapton, E5, to meet a young guy to find out about his experiences as a homeless young man.
There's a big rise in people between the ages of 18 and 25 that are homeless, but they're not sleeping on the street like that. They're in their friends' houses, or they're in their friend's mum's sofa, or they're on their, like, do you know what I mean?
Just having a roof over your head doesn't mean you have a home.
Exactly. There's a difference between having a roof and having a home, isn't it?
Jerome went into care at the age of 14 due to family breakdown. After leaving the care system 2 years later, he still hasn't been able to find an affordable place to live. When people paint a picture of a homeless person, it's not someone that looks like you or that looks like you or that looks like me. Why is that, do you think?
You don't want people to know. You don't want people to see that side of you. Like, not to be big-headed. I dress all right, I've got my trainers on, I look fresh, I've had a shower, I go to work. When I get paid, I'll go barbers. So no one knows that I'm homeless. Like, it's only like the people who know me and know like how long I've been sleeping on my sister's sofa, or I've been sleeping on my nan's sofa, or my aunt's sofa, or this person's sofa, that person's sofa, who really know that I'm homeless. 2-bedroom apartment, a spare room for my children to stay in when they came over. £400 a week, so that's what, that's £1,600 a month. So £1,600 a month, how many hours have you got to work to do that?
You've got 16, yeah, but then you've got bills.
Exactly, like no one's mentioned that. Why do I want to move out of London when all my family live here?
I think Jerome's probably quite an accurate picture of a lot of people who are the hidden homeless. You would never pick him out from a crowd as being homeless. He's very well kept, better kept than I am. He's basically everything that people would assume homeless isn't. What's your situation now?
So at the minute, I'm just on my aunt's sofa trying to find somewhere else to go.
So what are the options? Private bank,
private
council,
rent. Council's not an option. Not in London. Like, my cousin's been on the council list for 10 years. I don't ever want my children to go through the things that I've gone through and see the things that I've seen and like spend nights in McDonald's because they got nowhere else to go, or to walk around the streets all night because they got nowhere else to go. I don't want to see my children in that position ever.
After you, bro.
Thank you.
Everyone pins the beginning of the next stage of their life on when they get accommodation, and rightly so, because without that foundation, how can you build a life?
Safe, man.
Safe for that. All the best for the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it, man. Thanks for listening as well.
Respect.
All right.
Jerome's fortunate enough that he can help himself, but not everyone can.
Okay, there's a lot going on in that film, but just to pick out some of the important themes from a framing perspective. So obviously the wider experience of homelessness described in this film, hostels, sofa surfing. You'd also have seen systems, causes, so the effect of leaving the care system. You'd have seen a person who is actually in stable work, but still is not able to afford housing in his area, and the description of waiting lists for social housing and the limited options available to him. You'd have seen the difference between a roof and a home emphasised here, and the idea just at the end there that a home is the foundation from which to build a life. So some really powerful framing messages in that piece. And unfortunately, this series I don't think is available anymore, but there are a few short clips of some of the other episodes covering temporary accommodation and covering the experience of rough sleeping that I would encourage you to have a look at as well. And I just want to cover a few quick points just as to bring the session to a close. And it's a few tips just on avoiding othering and reinforcing the stigma that people facing homelessness experience every day. And the first is the idea of avoiding certain terms that kind of push people facing homelessness into a distinct group over here rather than being part of wider society. So avoiding referring to them, the homeless, rough sleepers, and instead emphasising people who are facing homelessness, people who are experiencing homelessness. And avoiding words like troubled and vulnerable, which give a sense of a sort of inherent character rather than helping to emphasise the circumstances and situations that people are facing. So in communications around the coronavirus, Crisis has tried to avoid using vulnerable to describe people and instead describing them as more exposed to or at higher risk of exposure to the pandemic. And again, trying to avoid language which we know is incredibly loaded in our culture, like addiction and addicts, and looking for alternatives that describe the situation in a less loaded way. And these are just really simple switches that we can make in our communications to help avoid othering. And lastly, I want to just leave you with an idea around myth busting. Myth busting is an approach that we see in communications all the time. And the research from the Frameworks Institute, drawing on some wider research in the US, tells us that actually myth busting is quite a kind of dangerous approach and can often result in reinforcing the myth that you are trying to undermine. And the reason is that by setting out the myth first, it activates an idea that people already hold, and it's really difficult to walk people back once you've already activated an idea that they already hold in their minds. And what we found, what this piece of research found in the US about a myth-busting piece of communications around the flu, is that people who were asked some questions about this piece of communications after they received it actually misremembered the myths as true. And when you asked them a bit later on, the results actually got worse. And really importantly here, people asked questions about this piece of communication, attributed the information about the myths to the organisation running the piece of communication. So it attributed the myths information to CDC in this example. So this research and other research around framing would suggest avoiding a myth-busting approach and instead focusing on the messages that you want people to hear, rather than reinforcing what ideas you would like to shift in the first place. And just to bring all of this together, I'd like to just show you one last film from Crisis, which pulls together a lot of the different themes that we've been talking about today. It uses values framing, it shows a wider experience of homelessness, and there are other messages in there too. So whilst we're watching, perhaps note down the different examples of framing that you spot, and I'll summarise them at the end.
To the young man struggling with his mental health. To the little boy whose mum had to leave before it was too late. The construction worker who was made redundant. the teenager leaving care without anyone to fall back on. The family, under the constant pressure of rising rents. To those criminalised simply for having nowhere to go. And to the 170,000 families and individuals who are homeless in 21st century Britain. We owe you dignity, respect, and a safe place to call home. By giving people the right support when they need it, and taking actions to prevent homelessness in the first instance, we know that a world without homelessness is possible. Our society is stronger when everyone has a place within it. Be the generation that ends homelessness.
Okay, so just to recap from that video and from the session more widely, you'd have seen that video, the wider experience of homelessness, of temporary accommodation, of different groups of people affected. You'd have seen systems causes, leaving care, the effect of being made redundant, the impacts of the Vagrancy Act. You saw constant pressure used here, so in this case describing the experience of rising rents and the impact that that has on families. You'd have seen moral human rights, values framing to surround stats on homelessness, treating people with dignity and respect in this case. And you'd have seen system solutions and that ending homelessness is possible. And then drawing the film to a close, our interdependence values being used to drive collective action with the call to be part of the generation that ends homelessness. So I hope that that was a useful film to bring together some of the themes and the ideas that we've been talking about today. And I finished on time, brilliant. That's all I have to share with you. Oh, actually, before I finish, really quickly, just to give a plug to the free resources that we have available on the Crisis website. If you want to explore this a bit more deeply, we have a series of introduction videos produced by the Frameworks Institute during lockdown, which go in more detail into the themes that I've talked about today. We have our Framing Homelessness Toolkit. I've taken some extracts from that today. And in November, we're running some online workshops. And in January, repeating those workshops, and they are open to anyone in the homelessness sector in the UK to join us. They'll be run by experts from the Frameworks Institute and going a bit more deeply and into some really practical examples and practical exercises around framing homelessness. So if you would like to book your place on those workshops, please do email me as soon as possible because our places are filling up. Okay, that's it from me. I'll stop sharing my screen.